In the final chapter of the Bible, in the last verses of the entire Christian canon, after the visions and the seals and the 7 bowls of wrath, after the New Jerusalem descends and the river of life runs clear through its streets, the risen Christ speaks. And in that last utterance, in the closing lines of the book that became the foundation of a civilization, he does not call himself the Son of Righteousness. He does not reach for the language of fire and sovereignty that runs through the prophets. He calls himself the bright morning star, the same astronomical image, the same title, the one that Jerome in the 4th century used to name the devil. This is not a coincidence that slipped past the authors of Revelation. They knew exactly what they were doing. The morning star title carries the full weight of Isaiah 14 into the last verse of the last book of the Bible, and it does so without explanation, without resolution, and without apology. 2 figures, 1 title, a paradox that the tradition tried for 2,000 years to explain away, and never quite could. The reason it could not be explained away is that the explanation does not begin in theology. It begins in Babylon. It begins with a planet. And it begins with a discovery that the ancient world found genuinely disorienting, that the brightest object in the night sky was, in a way that defied ordinary expectation, 2 things at once. Before we go any further, hold this in your mind. The planet Venus, the morning star, does something no other object visible to the naked eye does. It appears twice. Once before dawn, blazing alone in the eastern sky as the sun approaches, the last thing visible as darkness yields. And once at dusk, the first point of light to appear as the sun retreats, burning low in the west, while the rest of the sky is still pale. For centuries, the ancient world believed these were 2 different objects. The Babylonians cataloged them under separate names, assigned them separate ritual significances, observed their appearances in separate astronomical diaries. The Greeks called the morning appearance Phosphoros, the light bringer, and the evening appearance Hesperus. 2 stars, 2 presences with different emotional registers and different mythological identities. And then, somewhere in the 6th or early 5th century BCE, Pythagorean astronomy arrived at a recognition that must have felt, at first, like a mistake. They were looking at one thing, the same planet, a single body that descended below the western horizon in the evening and returned to the eastern sky before dawn. A star that went below the horizon and came back. The ancient world did not receive this as a mere astronomical correction. They built entire theologies around it. And the morning star paradox in the Bible, the one that gives the same title to the fallen angel and the risen Christ, only makes sense once you understand what that planet was doing in the ancient sky and what Babylon made of it. Today, we are going to follow the morning star all the way back, through the Greek of Revelation, through the Hebrew of Isaiah, through the mythology of Greece, and into the foundations of Babylon, to understand why a planet became a theological symbol, why that symbol was available to carry the weight of both fall and resurrection simultaneously, and what the tradition lost when it decided the star could only mean one thing. The text does not say morning star. That is the English translation. The Greek says something more precise. Ho aster ho lampros ho orthrinos. The bright star, the dawn star. 3 modifiers stacked onto a single astronomical noun, each one doing specific work. Lampros, bright, blazing. the word used for something that gives off its own light rather than merely reflecting it. Orthronos, from orthros, the hour before sunrise, the liminal moment when the sky is neither dark nor light, but suspended between the two. Not the night star, not the evening star, the dawn star, the star of the transitional hour. This is not a casual metaphor. Any educated reader of the first century, whether coming from the Greek literary tradition, the Jewish scriptural tradition, or the overlap between them, would have recognized orthronos as a technical astronomical designation. It places the star at a specific moment in the sky, the hour before the sun rises, when Venus burns alone at the eastern horizon as the only witness to the coming light. It is the most dramatic moment in the planet's appearance cycle. It is the moment when the star seems to summon the dawn rather than merely precede it. And the resonance with Isaiah 14 would have been immediate and unmistakable. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, that was the primary scriptural text for most of the authors of Revelation, translates Hillel ben Shachar as Hiosphoros, the dawnbringer, the morning star. The same astronomical moment. The figure in Isaiah 14 who says, "He will ascend above the heights of the clouds and make himself like the Most High," and who falls, cut down to the earth, is Hiosphoros, the dawnbringer, the same root word that orthronos invokes in Revelation 22:16. The question this raises is not a subtle one. The authors of Revelation were not careless writers. The book is structured with extraordinary deliberateness, built on layered scriptural allusion, every major image carrying a freight of prior tradition. When they place the phrase ho aster, ho lampros, ho orthrinos in the mouth of the risen Christ in the last verse of the last chapter, they knew exactly what they were invoking. They were reaching back to Isaiah. They were taking the morning star title that the tradition had assigned to the figure of pride and cosmic fall, and placing it, without qualification, on the risen Christ. This was not an oversight. It was a provocation, and it has never been fully resolved, because resolving it would require admitting what the astronomical image actually encodes, and what the planet Venus was doing in the ancient sky that made it available to carry the weight of both fall and ascent simultaneously. That is what we need to go back to Babylon to understand. Venus is an inner planet. This is the mechanical fact on which everything else in this video rests, and it needs to be held clearly before the mythological material can be understood. An inner planet is one whose orbit lies closer to the sun than the Earth's. Mercury is the other one. The consequence of this orbital position, from the perspective of an observer standing on Earth, is that an inner planet is never far from the sun in the sky. Venus cannot appear at midnight. It cannot rise when the sun sets, and set when the sun rises, the way the outer planets can. It is confined to the threshold hours, the period before sunrise, and the period after sunset. It is always close to the sun, always at the edge of the day, always either a herald or a remnant. This confinement to threshold hours is the astronomical fact that the ancient world found most striking about Venus. A body that blazed with extraordinary brilliance, brighter than anything in the night sky except the moon, bright enough on clear nights to cast a faint shadow, and yet could only appear at the margins of the day. A star of extraordinary power that was somehow bound to the edges of light, never free to move through the open sky the way Saturn or Jupiter moved. The outer planets were free. They ranged across the full vault of the night, rising and setting in opposition to the sun, visible at midnight, visible at all hours. Venus was not free. Venus was confined to the threshold. For ancient observers without any model of orbital mechanics, this combination, maximum brilliance, maximum restriction, must have been the most theologically pregnant phenomenon in the sky. Picture it without the theory. You are standing in open ground before dawn. The sky is still dark. Every other light in the sky is dim, distant, and steady. And then there is this, blazing alone at the eastern horizon, brighter than anything else, too bright to be comfortable to look at directly. An hour later, it is gone. The sun has risen and taken it. This is what the ancient world was working with every clear morning. The brightness was not merely a matter of degree. Venus reaches a visual magnitude of around -5 at its brightest, a measurement that would have meant nothing to a Babylonian astronomer, but the experience behind the number would have been unmistakable. On a clear night when Venus is near its maximum brilliance, it is not simply the brightest star in the sky. It is in a different category from the other stars, visible to the naked eye even in the daytime if you know exactly where to look, bright enough to be noticed in the hour after sunrise, if the sky is clear and the observer is paying attention. This was the object the ancient world was working with, not a bright star among other stars, but something that operated on a different register of visibility entirely. And then there is the shape. Venus, unlike the stars, and unlike most of the planets in ordinary observation, shows a visible disk under magnification. But more than that, it shows phases. As Venus moves through its orbit, it waxes and wanes like the moon, presenting a crescent when it is close to the Earth, a full disk when it is far. Ancient observers without telescopes could not see these phases clearly, but the effect of the phases on Venus's apparent brightness, the way it dimmed and brightened in a pattern that did not follow the simple logic of distance, added to the sense that this was an object that behaved by its own rules, that changed in ways that resisted simple explanation. The other consequence of Venus's orbital position is the phenomenon of inferior conjunction. This is the moment in the orbital cycle when Venus passes between the Earth and the Sun. At this point, Venus disappears entirely from the visible sky. From the perspective of an observer on Earth, it is as though the planet has ceased to exist. It goes below, into the brightness of the sun, behind the solar disk, and it is gone. For ancient observers who had no model of orbital mechanics, this disappearance was not the predictable consequence of a known geometric relationship. It was a vanishing, the brightest object in the sky extinguished, present and blazing one week, gone the next. No gradual dimming into the distance like a ship going over the horizon. A sudden disappearance into light. The period of invisibility at inferior conjunction lasts roughly 8 days. Then Venus reappears, but on the opposite side of the sky. If it disappeared as the evening star, sinking into the west as the sun set, it returns as the morning star, rising in the east before dawn. The star that went below has come back, transformed from one kind of presence into another, appearing in a different position in the sky at a different time of day, with a different relationship to the sun. the same brightness, the same scale of brilliance, but appearing to have passed through something, to have gone somewhere and returned. The full Venus cycle, from first appearance as morning star, through the complete circuit back to first appearance as morning star again, takes approximately 584 days. In that period, Venus moves through a sequence of phases: morning star blazing in the east, disappearance at superior conjunction behind the sun, reappearance as evening star in the west, then the shorter, deeper disappearance at inferior conjunction, and the return as morning star. Each phase has its own duration, its own characteristic brightness, its own relationship to the position of the sun. The Babylonian astronomers tracked all of it with meticulous precision in the astronomical diaries. The series of cuneiform tablets that recorded celestial observations night by night over centuries. These records were not simply scientific documentation in the modern sense. The astronomical diaries were ritual texts. The risings and settings of Venus were treated as omens of profound significance for the kingdom, for the harvest, for the fate of the king himself. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, a set of Babylonian astronomical records associated with a king of the first Babylonian dynasty in the 2nd millennium BCE, are among the earliest systematic astronomical observations in human history, and they are framed entirely as omen literature. If Venus disappears in the east and remains absent for 3 days, and reappears in the west, thus and thus will befall the land. The astronomical observation and the theological interpretation were not separate activities. They were the same activity. And the return of Venus after inferior conjunction, the reappearance of the morning star after the period of invisibility, was consistently treated in this literature as the most significant event in the cycle. The star had been absent. The world had been deprived of it. And now it blazed again in the east, before dawn, announcing the sun's coming in its new aspect. The return was an event. The return was what the cycle was for. This is the astronomical cycle that Babylon made into theology. The myth of Inanna's descent is the oldest written narrative we possess. The earliest versions come from the 3rd millennium BCE, inscribed on clay tablets in Sumerian, a language that was already ancient, already a language of ritual and scholarship rather than everyday speech by the time the texts were set down. The myth tells of the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, who descends into the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. The descent is structured with remarkable precision. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, a gatekeeper demands that Inanna surrender one of her divine attributes: her crown, her lapis lazuli staff, her measuring rod, her breastplate, her gold ring, her garment. Gate by gate, she is stripped of everything that makes her what she is. By the time she reaches the throne of Ereshkigal, she has been reduced to nothing. She is killed. Her body is hung on a hook. It is worth pausing here, because the detail, the body hung on a hook, is not a casual narrative flourish. It is a theological statement about the nature of the underworld and what it means to enter it fully. Inanna does not arrive at the throne of death and negotiate. She does not maintain her divine identity through the ordeal. She is destroyed. The queen of heaven becomes a corpse. The most powerful goddess in the Sumerian pantheon, stripped of all her attributes, is killed and displayed like meat. The myth does not sentimentalize the descent. It insists on its totality. If the descent is to mean anything, it must be real. The death must be actual. During her time in the underworld, the upper world suffers. The bull does not mount the cow. The man does not impregnate the woman. The world above is sterile in her absence, drained of the generative power she carries. Her death below produces a kind of death above. This is the key theological claim in the myth, that what happens in the underworld is not separate from what happens in the world above. The descent is not an isolated journey. It is an event with consequences for the entire structure of reality. When the Queen of Heaven is absent from the sky itself is diminished. The Akkadian version of the same myth, in which Inanna becomes Ishtar, the Semitic adaptation of the same divine figure that the Babylonians and Assyrians inherited from the Sumerian tradition, follows the same structural logic with significant elaborations. Ishtar's descent is explicitly framed as a matter of cosmic necessity. She answers the gatekeeper, who demands to know why she has come, to witness the house of dust, the house whose inhabitants are deprived of light, who eat clay and drink dirt, who wear feathers like birds and see no light, who dwell in darkness. This is not a journey undertaken out of grief or curiosity. It is something closer to obligation, the acknowledgement that the cycle requires the descent, that a theology of return requires that the descent be actual. But Inanna is restored. Through the intervention of Enki, the god of wisdom, she is brought back to life and permitted to ascend through the 7 gates, recovering her attributes one by one as she rises. The ascent through the 7 gates is the precise reversal of the stripping. Each gate restores what the previous descent took. She returns to the upper world transformed, not as she was before, but as something that has been to the place of death and returned from it, carrying a knowledge and an authority that she did not possess before. The descent is not erased. It is completed. It is what the return required. The astronomical encoding of this myth is not subtle. The 7 gates correspond to the 7 visible celestial bodies: the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. The stripping of attributes at each gate corresponds to Venus's behavior as it approaches inferior conjunction, growing dimmer and thinner as it descends toward the sun's brightness. The death and disappearance corresponds to inferior conjunction itself, the moment when Venus vanishes behind the solar disk. The restoration corresponds to Venus's reappearance on the other side, the return of the morning star, rising again in the eastern sky, blazing with renewed brilliance. Whether the myth was constructed as an intentional allegory for the Venus cycle, or whether the astronomical parallel is a structuring metaphor that shaped a myth with independent origins, is one of the genuine scholarly debates in the field. The more careful position is probably that the myth and the astronomical observation were not separate things that were later connected, but that they grew together, that observing the Venus cycle and narrating the Inanna descent were, for the Babylonian scribal tradition, versions of the same act of theological understanding. What is not in doubt is the significance the Babylonians assigned to the Venus cycle. The astronomical diaries, the Babylonian observational records that documented Venus's appearances with extraordinary precision, treat the risings and settings of Venus as omens of profound consequence. The first appearance of Venus as morning star, after a period of invisibility, was an event of cosmic significance, recorded with ceremonial attention. The return of the star was not merely an astronomical event. It was the return of something that had been absent from the world, a presence that the world required, and that the world had been deprived of. This is the theological framework that the morning star image carries into the Hebrew Bible, and ultimately into Revelation. Not merely brightness, not merely brilliance, the complete cycle, descent, disappearance, and return. The star that goes below the horizon is not destroyed. It comes back. And the return is not separate from the descent. It is the completion of the same movement. Jerome read the morning star and stopped at the fall. He saw the ascent toward heaven and the plunge toward the earth, and he read that as the entire story. What Babylon understood, what the astronomical reality demanded, was that the story does not end at inferior conjunction. The cycle continues. The star comes back. The Greeks inherited the Babylonian astronomical knowledge through the Persian period and the movements of scholarly tradition across the ancient Near East. But they did something characteristically their own with it. They split it. Where Babylon had Inanna, a single figure who descended and returned, whose identity was continuous through the cycle, the Greeks developed two separate mythological presences for the two appearances of Venus. Phosphoros, the light-bringer, was the morning star, the herald of the dawn, the figure who ran ahead of the sun to announce its coming, blazing in the eastern sky as the darkness retreated. He was associated with the threshold between night and day, with the moment of transition, with the particular quality of anticipation that belongs to the hour before sunrise. In Greek lyric, Phosphoros carries a tone of urgency and hope, the thing that comes before the thing that has been awaited. Hesperus, the evening star, carried a completely different emotional register. Where Phosphoros was associated with arrival and anticipation, Hesperus was associated with return and gathering. The poets used him as the star that called wanderers home, the first light that appeared when the day's labor was done, the signal that it was time to bring the sheep in from the hills and the children inside from play. Sappho addressed him directly in a famous fragment, the star that returns what the dawn scattered, treating him as the great collector, the figure who reverses the dispersal that morning brings. These were not two aspects of the same figure. They were genuinely distinct mythological presences, with different genealogies and different cultic associations and different emotional resonances. The Greek tradition had been elaborating both of them, separately as separate entities, for centuries. And then someone looked at the mathematics. The recognition attributed to the Pythagorean school, whether to Pythagoras himself or to his students working in the tradition he founded, probably in the period between the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, was that Phosphoros and Hesperus were tracking through the same orbital position. The appearances were offset but consistent. The morning star visible in the east before sunrise, the evening star visible in the west after sunset, and never both visible at the same time, always one or the other, with periods of total invisibility between. The mathematical relationship was unmistakable once someone was looking for it. They were looking at the same body. The mythological implications of this unification must have been genuinely unsettling. Two presences that the Greek tradition had been experiencing as distinct for generations were collapsed into one. The herald of dawn and the star of evening return were the same figure. The star that preceded the rising sun and the star that survived the setting sun were moments in a single cycle. The same planet, passing through different phases of a continuous orbital movement. If Phosphoros and Hesperus are one, then the descent of the evening star into the sun's afterglow and the emergence of the morning star before the sun's rising are not two separate events involving two separate beings. They are the same event seen from either side. The descent is the transformation. The star that goes down in the west returns in the east. The cycle that Babylon had encoded in the Inanna myth was confirmed from a completely different direction by Pythagorean mathematics. This is the intellectual context in which the Hebrew Halil ben Shachar needs to be read. The phrase means, precisely, the shining one, the son of the dawn. Shachar is the dawn, the specific moment of first light, the moment that the Greeks called orthros, and that the Latin tradition would call the aurora. Not yet sunrise, but the brightening of the sky that precedes the sun. Hallel is the blazing one, the one that shines with its own intense light. The son of the dawn is the thing that blazes most brilliantly in the dawn hour, before the sun rises and makes all other lights irrelevant. Isaiah's use of this image for the king of Babylon is built on an astronomical observation that any ancient reader would have understood immediately. The morning star rises. It climbs toward the sun. It reaches its maximum brightness and maximum height in the dawn sky. And then, as the sun rises, it disappears, consumed by the greater brightness. The ascent towards the heavens is precisely what causes the fall. The star climbs towards the sun, and the sun destroys it. This is the movement Jerome saw. And this is where he stopped, when he translated Hallel as Lucifer, the light bearer, the Latin equivalent of Phosphoros. He was making a legitimate lexical choice. The translation is defensible. What Jerome did with the movement, however, was not a translation choice. It was a theological one. He read the morning star's ascent and disappearance as the complete story: pride, overreach, and annihilation. The fall was permanent. The cycle was truncated at inferior conjunction. At the exact moment when the star vanishes into the sun, and the return was refused. But every astronomer in the ancient world, and every Babylonian scribe, and every Pythagorean mathematician knew that the story does not end at inferior conjunction. The star goes below the horizon, and then it comes back. The morning star vanishes into the sun. That is the astronomical fact. The theological question, the one that split the tradition, is whether the vanishing is the end of the story. One answer became dominant, another did not survive. There was a moment in Christian theological history when the full implications of the Venus cycle were not merely acknowledged, but developed into a systematic and serious doctrine. When the descent was understood not as defeat, but as passage, and when the return was understood not as a separate event belonging to a different figure, but as the completion of a single cosmic movement. Origen of Alexandria was the greatest theologian of the pre-Nicene Church by almost any measure. writing in the 3rd century, before the Council of Nicaea, before the institutional consolidation of orthodoxy, before the empire had adopted Christianity, and Christianity had adopted the institutional preferences of the empire, Origen developed a cosmological vision of breathtaking scope. The cosmos, in his understanding, was not a battlefield between a good God and a permanent evil adversary. It was a drama of departure and return. All rational beings, all logikoi, all creatures endowed with reason and will, had originated in a state of unity with the divine. Through their own choices, through their own movement toward multiplicity and material existence, they had descended into the conditions of finitude and suffering. And through the long economy of divine pedagogy, the providential education of souls through multiple ages and multiple conditions, they would all ultimately be restored. All of them, not most. Not the ones who had been only moderately wayward. All rational beings, including the figure of cosmic evil at the far end of the spectrum of departure from divine unity. Origen called this Apokatastasis, the restoration of all things, drawing on Paul's language in Colossians 1:20, where Christ reconciles to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, and in 1 Corinthians 15:28, where God will be all in all. These were not marginal texts. They were central Pauline claims, and Origen read them with the full seriousness of a philologist and theologian who trusted the text to mean what it said. The Venus cycle is present in Origen's cosmology not as an explicit metaphor, but as the underlying structural logic. The descent of rational beings from divine unity into material existence corresponds to the morning star's descent toward the sun, the movement toward a greater brightness that results paradoxically in disappearance. The long darkness of material existence, the multiple ages of suffering and education, correspond to the period of inferior conjunction, the vanishing of the star behind the solar disk. And the Apokatastasis, the universal restoration, corresponds to the return of the morning star. The same body, blazing on the other side, transformed by the transit, but continuous in identity. Gregory of Nyssa, writing in the late 4th century, held closely related views. Maximus the Confessor, the 7th century Byzantine theologian, who is the towering figure of Eastern Orthodox mystical theology, preserved the cosmological framework without the explicit universalism, developing what he called a theology of universal recapitulation, in which all things are ultimately summed up and returned to their source in Christ. But the doctrine, as Origen had stated it, with the explicit inclusion of the cosmic adversary in the final restoration, was condemned. At the Second Council of Constantinople, in 553 CE, nearly 300 years after Origen's death, the Origenist theses were formally anathematized. Among the condemned propositions, the pre-existence of souls, the ultimate restoration of all rational beings, the eventual salvation of the devil. Ask the question directly. Was Apokatastasis condemned because it was theologically wrong, or because it was institutionally incompatible with the kind of church the Roman Empire needed? A church that taught the eventual restoration of Lucifer could not sustain the same relationship to a permanent cosmic adversary. And the entire architecture of the medieval church's engagement with its perceived enemies, the logic of crusade, inquisition, and holy war, rested on the premise that the adversary was real, permanent, and without prospect of redemption. The devil had to be a permanent fixture, a genuine ontological opponent, a force that justified extraordinary measures in the world. A cosmos in which even Lucifer would eventually return to divine unity was not a cosmos that could sustain that architecture. What was lost in the condemnation of 553 CE is exactly what the Venus cycle would have preserved. The theological possibility that the descent is not the end of the story, that the star which goes below the horizon is not destroyed, that the cycle of departure and return operates at the level of the cosmos itself, and that no movement away from the divine is so extreme that it places its subject outside the arc of return. The tradition chose the truncated reading, inferior conjunction as permanent death. The morning star that falls and does not rise, but the star rises, it always has. We have now assembled all of the pieces: the astronomical cycle, the Babylonian theological encoding, the Greek fracture and Pythagorean reunification, the Hebrew Hallel and Jerome's truncation, the Origenist universalism and its suppression. The whole architecture is in place. But before we bring it to bear on Revelation 22:16, there is one more layer to add, one that the biblical scholarship of the late 20th century opened up, and that the tradition's official reading had been systematically avoiding for 2 millennia. Margaret Barker is a British biblical scholar whose work on what she calls temple theology represents one of the most significant recent challenges to the standard account of how the Hebrew Bible came together. Her central argument, developed across a series of books beginning in the 1980s, is that the religion practiced in the first temple, Solomon's temple, the pre-exilic Jerusalem cult, was substantially different from the religion enshrined in the final form of the Hebrew Scriptures, and that the difference was not incidental. It was the result of a deliberate reform. The reform Barker identifies is the Deuteronomic reform of the 7th century BCE, the period associated with King Josiah, in which a book of the law was allegedly discovered in the temple and used as the basis for a thoroughgoing religious restructuring. In Barker's reconstruction, the Deuteronomic reform suppressed a significant body of pre-exilic Israelite religious practice, including practices associated with the figure she calls the morning star. In the pre-exilic temple, Barker argues, the morning star had a specific cultic identity. It was associated with a divine sun figure, a figure who stood in a particular relationship to the Most High God, who was associated with light and wisdom, and whose descent and return was a central element of the temple liturgy. The high priest, in certain ritual contexts, represented or embodied this figure. The anointing of the king was connected to the installation of this Son of God in the cosmic order. The morning star was not merely a poetic image, it was a cultic presence. The Deuteronomic reform suppressed this tradition. The theology that survived in the final form of the Hebrew Bible, the edited Deuteronomically shaped canon, reflects a more rigidly monotheistic framework in which the divine council and the divine sons of God have been demoted or removed. What was preserved from the pre-Reformed tradition survived in fragments, in texts that were either kept because their subversive potential was not fully recognized, or because they were too embedded in the liturgical tradition to excise entirely. Isaiah 14, in this reading, is not simply a polemic against the king of Babylon. It is a text that carries, in compressed and repurposed form, the memory of a theological tradition about the morning star that the Deuteronomic reform had tried to eliminate. The Hillel ben Shachar of Isaiah 14 is not a figure invented for the purpose of satirizing the Babylonian king. He is a figure drawn from an older Israelite theological vocabulary, a vocabulary in which the morning star was a genuine theological entity, a divine sun associated with both ascent and descent, with both the blazing brightness of the dawn sky and the disappearance into the sun. If Barker is right and her work has attracted significant scholarly attention, both critical and admiring, then Revelation 22:16 is not only invoking Isaiah, it is reaching back past Isaiah to the pre-Deuteronomic tradition that Isaiah encoded in fragments. The authors of Revelation were reaching for a theological vocabulary that the mainstream tradition had tried to suppress for 600 years. When they gave the morning star title to the risen Christ, they were not simply doing Christological polemics against a counterfeit figure. They were recovering a tradition in which the morning star was always the symbol of divine descent and return, in which the pattern of going below and coming back was not a scandal or a threat, but the deepest movement in the cosmos. This is the context in which the shared title in Revelation 22:16 must finally be read. Now consider what is actually happening in that text. The authors of Revelation were saturated in the Hebrew scriptural tradition. The book is, among other things, one of the most intricate works of biblical allusion ever composed, a tissue of references to Daniel and Ezekiel and Isaiah and Zechariah so dense that no single interpretive tradition has been able to map all of them. They knew Isaiah 14. They knew Hiosphoros. They knew what the morning star title carried. And in the last verse of the last chapter, they gave that title precisely, technically, with the full astronomical weight of the Orthronos designation, to the risen Christ. The question is not whether this was deliberate. It was deliberate. The question is what the deliberateness claims. One reading, the one the tradition has generally preferred, is that the shared title is a polemic. Christ is the true morning star. The figure of Isaiah 14 is a counterfeit, a pretender who aspired to what Christ legitimately holds. The similarity is the point of the contrast, not the point of a connection. This reading keeps the two figures separate, one genuine, one fraudulent, and explains the shared title as the tradition's way of marking the fraud as fraud. But this reading requires the astronomical image to carry a burden it cannot bear. Because the point of the morning star image is precisely that it cannot be divided into a genuine instance and a counterfeit. Venus is not two planets, one real and one false. It is one planet, passing through a cycle that requires both the descent and the return. The image is inherently cyclical. It cannot be split into a fallen half and a risen half without losing the thing that makes it an image at all. You cannot take the Inanna descent myth and separate it into the descent and the return and claim the descent belongs to one figure and the return belongs to a different one. The myth is the cycle is the point. What the shared title in Revelation 22:16 actually claims, what the astronomical logic and the Babylonian theological tradition, and the pre-Deuteronomic Israelite religious memory all converge to demand, is something more structurally radical than a polemic. It is a claim about the pattern itself. The morning star is the symbol of a movement, descent into darkness, disappearance, and return. This movement is not divided between two different figures, occupying the symbol at different points in history. It is a single pattern, and the Christological narrative maps onto it with a precision that cannot be accidental. Consider the correspondences. The incarnation, God taking on finitude, descending into the conditions of human existence, is the descent toward inferior conjunction. The kenosis that Paul describes in Philippians 2, the self-emptying of the divine into flesh, is the movement of the morning star towards the sun. Brightness approaching greater brightness. Identity approaching dissolution. The death is inferior conjunction itself. The moment when the star vanishes behind the solar disk. The moment when the light that blazed most brilliantly in the dawn sky is extinguished. Not gradually dimmed. Extinguished. Gone behind a greater brightness. And the resurrection, the reappearance, the return of the same body blazing with renewed intensity on the other side of the transit, is the morning star's reemergence in the pre-dawn sky. The same body, transformed by the passage. The resurrection is discovered at dawn. This is not incidental. Every gospel account places the discovery in the early morning, the hour before sunrise, the hour that the Greek of Revelation 22:16 calls orthrinos. The women arrive at the tomb in the orthros hour, in the dawn hour, in the precise atmospheric moment when Venus blazes most brilliantly at the eastern horizon, the only light still burning as the darkness retreats. The hour of the morning star is the hour of the resurrection. The correspondence is not symbolic. It is structural. The harrowing of hell, the descent of Christ into the realm of the dead between crucifixion and resurrection, preserved in the Apostles' Creed and in the first letter of Peter, developed in the apocryphal literature, is Inanna's descent through the seven gates, the stripping, the death, the time of absence during which the upper world is changed by the loss, and the return, the star blazing on the other side, recovered, transformed, carrying what it went down to retrieve. Jerome's Lucifer is a truncation of this entire pattern. He saw the morning star's ascent toward the sun and read it as pride. He saw the disappearance into the sun's brightness and read it as permanent annihilation. He stopped the cycle at inferior conjunction and called that stopping theological truth. And the entire Western construction of the cosmic adversary, permanent, irredeeming, the dark counterpart, without which no system of holy war could be justified, was built on that stopped clock. On the insistence that the movement was only descent, never return, that the star fell, and the fall was the end. But the Babylonian astronomers who cataloged the Venus cycle knew the cycle continued. The Greek mathematicians who identified Phosphoros and Hesperus as the same body knew the descent and the return were one movement. And the authors of Revelation, who placed the full astronomical title in the mouth of the risen Christ, in the last verse of the last chapter, were refusing as explicitly as the grammar of liturgical poetry allows to stop the clock where Jerome had stopped it. What the shared title claims is not that Christ and the figure of Isaiah 14 are the same being. It claims something more precise and more disorienting than that. It claims that the pattern, the descent, the disappearance, and the return, is not divided between a fallen one and a risen one. It belongs to the movement itself. The morning star that goes below the horizon and the morning star that blazes in the pre-dawn sky are not two different stars occupying the same symbolic role at different historical moments. They are one star, and the cycle is one cycle. And the descent is not the opposite of the return, but its necessary condition. You cannot have the dawn blazing without the darkness that preceded it. You cannot have the return without the going down. Jerome stopped the cycle at the fall. The authors of Revelation refused that stopping. In the last verse of the last chapter of the canon, they left the question open, not through confusion, not through carelessness, but with the full deliberateness of people who understood exactly what the image carried and chose to let it carry all of it. All of Babylon, all of the Pythagorean Unification, all of Origen's Apokatastasis, all of Barker's pre-Deuteronomic memory of a morning star theology that the tradition had suppressed, and that the last verse of the last chapter was quietly, insistently recovering. The tradition that followed them tried to resolve what they had left unresolved. It condemned Origen. It insisted on the permanence of the fall. It built an entire theology on the truncated cycle. And at the end of the book, the star is still there. Ho Ashtar ho lampros ho orthrinos. The bright dawn star, claimed by the risen Christ, carrying the whole weight of Babylon and Isaiah and the Pythagorean Unification and the suppressed pre-exilic temple theology, still asking the question that the tradition spent 2 millennia trying not to answer. Venus is still there before the sun rises. This has not changed. The astronomical cycle that the Babylonian scribes cataloged in their observational diaries, that the authors of the Inanna descent encoded in myth, that the Pythagorean school recognized in the mathematics of orbital positions, that the authors of Revelation placed in the last verse of the last chapter of the Christian canon, that cycle continues, undisturbed by the theological decisions made about it. The tradition drew a line through the Venus cycle and declared one half of it sacred and the other half damned. The descent was Lucifer. The ascent was Christ. The fall was permanent, and the return belonged to a different story entirely. For 2,000 years, this division held, institutionally, doctrinally, architecturally, in the great systems of medieval theology. It was enforced at councils. It was written into creeds. It was the premise on which empires organized their violence. And at the end of the book, in the last verse, the star did not cooperate. Ho Ashtar, ho lampros, ho orthrinos, the bright dawn star, the star of the transitional hour, the liminal body that blazes at the edge of darkness as the day prepares to begin. The same star that Isaiah's king of Babylon reached toward and fell from. The same star that Inanna was stripped down to pass through on her way to the place of death. The same star that the Pythagoreans recognized as the evening star transformed. The same body on the other side of its transit through the sun. The tradition wanted the descent and the return to be 2 different stories about 2 different figures. The astronomy refused. 1 planet, 1 cycle. The star that goes below the horizon always comes back. It is still there, before dawn, at the edge of the darkness, blazing.